something so serious happened that God himself had to break a father and son apart, not just move Abraham, but surgically remove him from his bloodline, his household, his father's very shadow. This wasn't about distance, it was about destiny. Before God could build a nation, before he could give land, before he could speak the promise, he had to cut away something, someone. His name was Terah. You know Abraham as the father of faith. But behind every calling is a severing, a separation that hurts before it heals. And hidden in the silence between Genesis 11 and Genesis 12 is a mystery most believers have never seen. Why did God tell Abraham to leave his father's house? Was it just a relocation, or was it a spiritual revolution? What if I told you the future of the covenant depended on one man's death? This is echoes of the Nazarene, where hidden Bible stories, ancient history, and prophetic insight collide. If you're ready to see the scriptures like never before, subscribe, stay to the end, and let's begin the journey. Chapter 1. The man behind the curtain. Who was Terah? He's barely mentioned, a footnote in most sermons, a name that opens the genealogy and vanishes into silence. But that silence is not empty. It is loaded with divine intention. Because sometimes what Scripture doesn't say is louder than what it does. His name is Terah, the father of Abraham, the man God did not choose. You see, for most people, the story begins in Genesis 12. Go from your country, your people, and your father's household. But that's not where the real story starts. The true origin is Ur, a city of gold gods and grand illusions, a place where the moon god Sin was worshipped from towering ziggurats, where stars dictated destinies, and where generations were raised to bow before stone. Terah lived there. He thrived there. He raised Abram, Nahor, and Haran in a city built on celestial superstition. And we don't have to speculate. Long ago, your ancestors, including Terah, the father of Abraham, lived beyond the Euphrates and served other gods. Joshua 24:2. There it is, plain and blunt. The father of faith was born of a man who bowed to demons. And that's the first twist. Abraham's story didn't begin in faith. It began in idolatry. Terah didn't just live in Ur, he was formed by it. He wasn't a passive bystander, he was a practitioner. That word served in Hebrew, abad, doesn't mean casual belief. It means labor, devotion, ritual loyalty. He was committed. This wasn't cultural habit, it was a spiritual stronghold. And Terah didn't just participate in it, he embodied it. Imagine his household altars of stone, incense to the moon, sacred carvings on the walls, a religion of cycles, fertility, dreams, and death. And this is the world Abraham was born into. Suddenly the words of God make more sense. Leave your country, your people, and your father's house. This wasn't just about geography. This was a divine extraction from a corrupted spiritual lineage. Because here's the uncomfortable truth, God didn't call Abraham out of nowhere, he called him out of someone. Before God could establish covenant, before he could give land descendants and blessing, he had to make a cut. God couldn't build the future on a foundation that reeked of the past. He had to separate bloodline from blueprint, not biologically, but theologically. Terah was not just Abraham's father, he was the system God had to shut down. That's why there are no sermons praising him, no monuments, no psalms, only a shadow and a silence. Because sometimes what God spares us from is just as sacred as what he gives us. But the haunting part is this: Terah started the journey to Canaan. He had the vision, he had the map, he even left Ur. But he stopped in a place called Haran, and there he died, not just physically, but symbolically. A man who almost entered the promise, a man who almost changed history, but almost doesn't change the world. Obedience does. So why did God separate Abraham from his father? Because to call someone into destiny, God sometimes has to cut out what raised you. Terah wasn't just a man, He was a system, a shadow, a stronghold, and until Abraham left it behind, God would not speak the promise. But that separation was just the beginning, because what Terah couldn't finish, Abraham was about to begin. Stay with me, because chapter 2 will take us deeper into 2 cities, 2 spiritual systems, and 1 invisible test that still confronts every believer today. Chapter 2, and Haran, 2 cities, 1 pattern. To understand why God separated Abraham from Terah, we have to understand the cities they walked through and the spirit each city carried, because God never tells us to leave a place unless that place has the power to define us. Was no desert backwater. It was a marvel of the ancient world. It boasted libraries, palaces, canals, even plumbing. Gold and lapis lazuli adorned its temples. Mathematics, astrology, law all flourished under its grandeur. But behind the brilliance was bondage. At the heart of stood the ziggurat of Ur-Nammu, a massive temple to Sin, the moon god, the deity of cycles, shadows, fate, and false light. Worship in wasn't passive. It demanded blood. It demanded loyalty. It shaped how families thought worked, even named their children. And this is where Terah called home. This was the soil of Abraham's childhood, a city whose gods ruled by fear and fatalism, not love and covenant. So when God said, "Leave your country," he wasn't just pointing to dirt. He was severing Abraham from a civilization that trained people to submit to the stars instead of the creator of them. But here's the twist: Terah did leave Ur. He took his sons, his grandson Lot, even the household. He started the journey to Canaan, the land of promise. But he never made it. He stopped in a place called Haran. And what most people miss is this: Haran wasn't just a detour, it was a duplicate. Haran too was a center of moon worship. Its temples bore the same rituals, the same idols, the same spirits. It looked like progress. But spiritually, it was all over again. Same gods, same system, just a different zip code. The name Haran itself in Hebrew means parched or delay. And how fitting, because that's exactly what Haran became, a spiritual wasteland where destiny was paused, not fulfilled. Haran was not the end of the road. It was the place where obedience went to die slowly. Terah began the journey toward promise. But when faced with the discomfort of full obedience, he chose the familiar just with a different facade. Was his past. Haran became his prison. And in that middle place, that almost place, Terah died. Now pause for a moment, because this isn't just about 2 cities on an ancient map. This is about the war inside every believer. God calls us out of out of the obvious places of bondage. But the true test isn't just leaving Egypt. It's refusing to settle in the wilderness. Is where your chains were forged. Haran is where you're tempted to rest. And here's the danger: Haran still feels religious. It still has altars, still has rituals, but it's not where God is taking you. It's the land of half-obedience, the illusion of movement with no arrival. Terah started well. He had vision. He had map. He even had Abraham with him. But he stopped where it was safe, where it looked like change but wasn't. And maybe that's where you are. Stuck between what God called you out of and what you're too afraid to let go of. Is gone. But Haran still holds you. Because not every prison looks like chains. Some look like comfort. Some speak your language. Some let you almost obey, just not fully. But here's the haunting truth. Almost obedience is still disobedience. And until Abraham left Haran, until he buried the last remnant of that old system, God did not speak again. And in chapter 3, we'll uncover the moment God finally broke the silence. But only after Terah died. You'll discover how this one death wasn't just biological, it was the signal that heaven had been waiting for. So don't stop here. The next chapter will change how you see Abraham's calling forever. Chapter 3, the divine cut. Why God had to separate them. There's a reason why Genesis 12 doesn't begin with a blessing, but with a command. Go from your country, your people, and your father's household to the land I will show you. Genesis 12:1. Before the promise, before the covenant, before the lineage that would one day lead to the Messiah, there had to be a separation, not just a relocation, a radical cut. Because God doesn't build the holy on foundations still soaked in the profane. Faith doesn't grow in idolatry's shadow, and Abraham was still standing in it. The command was surgical. Leave your country, the system you were raised in. Leave your people, the culture that formed your instincts. Leave your father's house, the very identity you inherited. It's not just about movement. It's about unmaking everything the old world had planted in him. And this was not metaphorical. It was literal. It was relational. It was painful. We forget how hard this was. Abraham wasn't leaving a stranger. He was leaving his father, his protector, provider, cultural anchor. He was walking away from the hands that had raised him, the stories he grew up with, the traditions that shaped his view of the divine. But all of that, the land, the people, the house had been soaked in generations of spiritual distortion. The same hands that held him as a child had also built altars to the moon. And God knew something Abraham didn't yet understand. You can't walk into the unknown future with the chains of a known past still dragging behind you. This was the divine cut, a spiritual amputation that spared no sentimentality. God was not rejecting family. He was redefining it. Because the promise he was about to give Abraham could not survive inside the walls of Terah's worldview. You cannot inherit Canaan if you're still living in Ur's mindset. God wasn't just calling Abraham out. He was calling him into something that required purity, separation, consecration. This wasn't just the beginning of a journey. It was the end of a bloodline's influence. It was the deconstruction of a dynasty so that heaven could birth something entirely new. Now picture it. Abraham standing on the edge of Haran. Behind him, his father's grave, his culture's altars, his childhood gods. In front of him, nothing but dust, the unknown, a voice, and still, he steps. That single step wasn't just geographical, it was generational. It said, I am not bound by where I come from. I am called by the one who made me. But let's not oversimplify this moment. Obedience costs. It severs. Abraham didn't just lose his father, he lost the comfort of cultural continuity, the security of tradition, the illusion of control. But in return, he gained something only obedience can unlock: revelation. I will show you. God never gave Abraham a map. He gave him presence, because when God calls you to leave everything, he doesn't promise certainty, he promises himself. So why did God separate Abraham from Terah? Because there are moments in history and moments in your life where heaven cannot advance until something earthly breaks. And in Abraham's case, that break had to be from the very man who raised him. God couldn't speak new promises, while old altars still had a voice. But here's the question now. What have you built your faith on, a promise from God or a pattern from your past? Because until that cut happens, you might be living near destiny, but never inside it. And in chapter 4, we'll examine that pattern more closely. Because Haran wasn't just a place Abraham passed through. It became a spiritual test, a threshold between obedience and stagnation. Stay with me. The most defining moment is still to come. Chapter 4. The weight of legacy. Blood versus covenant. Abraham's journey wasn't just a migration. It was a collision between two legacies, and only one could survive. On one side stood Terah, the father, the past, the bloodline. On the other stood the covenant, the future, the unknown, the divine invitation. You see, we often think faith begins with inspiration, but most of the time it begins with a painful choice. And that's where Abraham stood, between blood and calling, between honoring what raised him and obeying the one who was remaking him. Because here's a truth that cuts deep. Not everything you inherited was meant to be preserved. Some things must be buried before promise can bloom. Terah represented more than just a father. He symbolized an entire system, a worldview, a culture, a spirituality that had no room for the kind of faith God was birthing. God wasn't just calling Abraham to leave geography. He was calling him to leave identity, the one built by man for one shaped by heaven. And that's the real tension. Blood says, this is where you come from. Covenant says, this is who you're becoming. Think about this. Terah was not an evil man. He wasn't abusive. He wasn't violent. He simply belonged to an old world, one governed by idols, compromise, and spiritual stagnation. And that's what makes the test so hard. If Terah had been a monster, the decision would have been easy. But Terah was a father, a builder, a man who almost obeyed. And sometimes the most dangerous legacy isn't the one that's wicked, but the one that's almost righteous. Because almost obedience still births disobedience, and almost truth still breeds deception. Sometimes the greatest test of faith is leaving behind those we love most. God's call to Abraham wasn't cruel. It was costly because covenant always is. We are conditioned to believe that love means never letting go. But in the economy of heaven, there are times when letting go is the purest form of obedience. Because if Abraham clung to Terah's house, he would have inherited Terah's limits. And the God of the universe wasn't building a nation of idolaters, he was building a lineage of faith. Now let's make this personal. We all have Terahs in our lives. People, patterns, places, things we love, but which God never intended to take with us. And here's where it gets uncomfortable. Sometimes God asks us to walk away, not because they were evil, but because they no longer fit where he's taking us. You can't build the future with bricks molded in the past, and you can't receive the covenant if you're still anchored to the compromise. So Abraham obeyed, not perfectly, not without fear, but he obeyed enough to move, enough to trust, enough to let go. He honored his father's memory, but he refused to let it define his destiny, because covenant always demands a greater allegiance than blood. So now we know Terah wasn't just a man. He was a threshold between what was human and what was holy. But why couldn't he cross it? Why did a man who started the journey to Canaan die in the middle? In chapter 5, we'll expose the deeper reason Terah never entered the promise. Because when the moon god still rules your loyalty, you might move forward geographically, but never spiritually. And there's a reason God never spoke again until Terah was gone. Stay with me, because chapter 5 will reveal how idolatry survives in disguise, and how it cost one man the future. Chapter 5, when the moon god rules. Why Terah couldn't enter the promise. There's a reason Terah never made it to Canaan. It wasn't just age, it wasn't the distance, it wasn't fatigue. It was because he never truly left even after he walked away from it. Terah carried something with him, not in his bags, but in his bones. Had shaped him, not just externally, but internally. Its gods had whispered into his worldview. Its altars had carved themselves into his conscience. Its rhythms had trained his loyalties. And though Terah physically stepped out of never stepped out of Terah. That's why when he reached Haran, a city that also worshipped the moon god Sin, he felt at home. It was familiar, comfortable, spiritually identical. Same rituals, same deities, same gravitational pull of compromise. It was just with different dirt. And that's the danger. Familiar bondage will always invite you to settle. Terah's failure wasn't rebellion. It was residue. He carried Babylon in his bag, not just literal idols, but spiritual assumptions. He brought Ur's values into Haran's borders. He never crossed over into a new paradigm, just into another version of the same one. And that's why he died there, because you cannot step into God's promise while still clinging to Babylon's blueprint. hook you can't bring Babylon into Canaan. The old gods don't coexist with the living God. The old system has to be cut, not carried. God's promise demands full obedience, not halfway stops. And Haran was the ultimate halfway stop. It looked better than but it wasn't the place of promise. It was safe, but it was stagnant. And that's what makes Terah's story so tragic. He wasn't evil, he wasn't faithless, he was almost left idolatry, almost entered the land, almost fulfilled the call, but almost never fulfills God's purpose. Now listen carefully, Haran represents something deeper than geography. It's the place we settle when obedience becomes inconvenient, when transformation starts to cost us our comfort, when full surrender feels too risky. It's the place where we tell ourselves, this is far enough. At least it's not, I've changed. Just not that much. God understands. This is good enough. But good enough is not obedience. It's a spiritual stall. Haran is the graveyard of the halfway faithful, a place where vision stops breathing, where movement disguises compromise. And maybe, just maybe, that's where you are. You've left the old place, but you're still lingering in something that looks cleaner, yet smells of the same gods. A new city, a new language, but the same moon still rules your night. Because the gods of don't mind if you leave, as long as they can ride with you. So why couldn't Terah enter the promise? Because he never made the internal break. He didn't just need a change of scenery, he needed a change of lordship. And God wasn't looking for someone who visited obedience, he was looking for someone who would inhabit it. Terah wasn't that man, but Abraham was about to become him. And in chapter 6, we'll witness the true test of inheritance, not in how we start the journey, but in how we respond when the last tie to our past finally dies. Terah is buried, Haran still stands. But now Abraham must choose. Will he remain in the land of delay, or will he take the step his father never could? The answer is the turning point of everything that follows. Stay with me. It's about to shift. Chapter 6. Haran. The spirit of almost. Haran. A name that fades quietly into biblical geography. But beneath the dust of its syllables hides a devastating reality. Haran isn't just a city, it's a spirit. It's the spirit of almost obedient, almost surrendered, almost faithful. And in the eyes of heaven, almost is still not enough. Abraham had left he had stepped out of the land of idols, he had followed his father into motion, but then the motion stopped. Terah died in Haran, but Abraham stayed at least for a time. Why? Because Haran is the place between clarity and compromise. It's where the vision goes quiet, where the soul stalls, where movement looks like progress, but it's actually paralysis in disguise. Haran is the place where destinies die slowly. It doesn't kill you in a day, it kills you over years, by giving you just enough comfort to numb your hunger, just enough spirituality to satisfy your guilt, just enough tradition to convince you you've arrived, but you haven't. You're in Haran, and Haran always whispers, settle here. You've come far enough. You're better than you used to be. God understands. Let's be clear, Abraham didn't sin by being in Haran, but had he stayed, he would have missed the voice of God. There's a mystery in Genesis that many overlook. God's famous call, leave your country and your father's house, doesn't come until after Terah dies. God waited, not because he needed Abraham to mourn, but because Abraham couldn't hear the next instruction until he buried the last influence. You can't embrace a new future while protecting old attachments. Terah's death wasn't just a personal loss. It was a spiritual release. Now the path was clear. Now the call was direct. Now the journey could truly begin. But here's the warning. Many never leave Haran. They build houses in the in-between. They raise families in delay. They plant ministries in compromise. They memorize scriptures in places God never told them to remain. Haran feels holy, but it's outside the will of God, because partial obedience is still rebellion, even when it's dressed in religious language. And God doesn't move in places that refuse to move with him. Now think about this. What if Abraham had stayed? What if he had become a good man, a respected elder, worshiping the one true God? But in a city that still bowed to the moon, he might have lived a quiet life. But the world would have never known his name. There would be no Isaac, no Jacob, no Israel, no Messiah. Haran would have become the graveyard, not just of Terah, but of history itself. And maybe you're there now, not in rebellion, not in but in Haran. You've obeyed enough to leave your past, but not enough to step into the promise. You're safe, but not surrendered. In motion, but not moving forward. You've almost let go. And the Spirit of God is calling again. Leave, go, I will show you. Genesis 12:1. Because true faith doesn't settle in halfway cities. It keeps walking, it crosses over, it leaves Haran behind forever. In chapter 7, we'll witness that moment when God finally breaks his silence and speaks directly to Abraham for the first time, but only after Haran is behind him. This next word would not just change a man, it would alter the destiny of the world. Stay with me. The voice of God is about to speak. Chapter 7. The day Terah died, a new era begins. It's one of the most overlooked transitions in all of Scripture. A moment so quiet, most people read past it without ever pausing. But between the final verse of Genesis 11 and the first verse of Genesis 12, everything changes. And Terah died in Haran. Genesis 11:32. Then the Lord said to Abram, "Go from your country, your people, and your father's household." Genesis 12:1. One verse ends with a funeral, the next begins with a calling. And that's no accident, because the death of Terah wasn't just the end of a man, it was the end of a system, the close of a season, the necessary death that made room for a divine voice. When the old dies, the voice of God returns. Abraham had waited, watched, walked with his father through the residue of idolatry, through the echoes of and the comfort of Haran. But as long as Terah lived, the sound of God was silent. Heaven held its breath. Why? Because Abraham could not fully hear the next chapter while still standing in the shadow of the last one. God waits for moments. He doesn't just speak at random. He speaks when our hands are finally empty enough to receive. Terah's death marked more than grief. It marked permission. Permission for God to begin something new. Permission for Abraham to finally become more than a son, to become a father of nations. But let's not gloss over the cost. Abraham didn't just bury his father. He buried his final tie to the past, the last thread of his identity rooted in And with Terah in the ground, there were no more excuses, no more delays, no more halfway homes, only the voice and a choice. Would he stay in Haran, or would he step into the unknown? And that's what makes Genesis 12 so radical. God doesn't start with reassurance, he starts with disruption. Go. Leave everything you've ever known. This is the divine rhythm. Death, then calling. Loss, then instruction. Because heaven will not speak into a space still ruled by the ghosts of yesterday. And once again, God speaks with precision. Leave your land. Leave your people. Leave your father's house. Yes, even now, even after Terah's death, God reiterates the cut. Because this isn't just about physical absence, it's about spiritual allegiance. Terah may be buried, but is his influence still breathing in Abraham's soul? This is where many fail. We bury the person, but carry the pattern. We say goodbye to the relationship, but still think like the environment that shaped us. The true test of obedience isn't just in what we walk away from, it's in what we refuse to take with us. And this is the pivot point. From this moment forward, Abraham is no longer just a man on a journey. He's a man under command. He's no longer being led by inheritance. He's being led by revelation. The man who once followed his father will now follow the Father of all creation. And in chapter 8, we'll explore the actual covenant words God spoke, not just as a promise to Abraham, but as a pattern for every believer called out of compromise and into calling. The voice of God has returned. But what it says next will change the entire story of redemption. Stay with me. The promise is about to unfold. Chapter 8. Abraham's real calling wasn't land, it was separation. Most people think Abraham's calling was about land, a physical place, a divine inheritance, a promised possession. And yes, the land was part of the story, but it wasn't the foundation of the call. Before God ever spoke of geography, he issued a command of severance, not a roadmap, but a knife. Go from your country, your people, and your father's house. Genesis 12:1. It was never just about where Abraham was going. It was about what he had to leave behind in order to get there. The promise wasn't built on land, it was built on obedience. And obedience always starts with separation. Before destiny comes separation. Before blessing, there must be burning bridges. Because God does not entrust the sacred to someone still straddling the secular. He does not release legacy to a heart still tethered to safety. He does not birth nations through a man who won't let go of nostalgia. Let's be clear, Abraham's calling was radical, not just because of where he went, but because of what he refused to carry into the next season. He left behind blood ties. He abandoned the comfort of familiar rhythms. He walked away from the entire structure of identity as defined by ancient Mesopotamian culture. This wasn't just movement, it was rebirth. God wasn't relocating Abraham, he was recreating him. And it's this that we often miss. We want the promise of Abraham without the pain of Abraham. We want to inherit without being cut. We want fullness without separation. We want to walk with God, but without giving up who we were when he found us. But that's not covenant, that's convenience. Look closely at the pattern. God didn't promise Abraham a nation until Abraham left his own. He didn't reveal the land until Abraham walked into the unknown. He didn't speak of blessing until Abraham stepped out of Haran. Everything followed separation. Nothing came before it. Because separation is not the price of blessing, it's the precondition. This wasn't punishment, it was preparation. God wasn't being harsh, he was being holy. He was pruning Abraham, cutting away the lesser so he could plant the greater. Because a new identity can't be layered on top of an old one, it must rise from ashes. And now we begin to understand why God was silent for so long. He wasn't ignoring Abraham, he was waiting for Terah to die, for Haran to be behind, for Abraham to be alone enough to hear the fullness of what God wanted to say. Sometimes God waits to speak until you've walked far enough that going back isn't an option. Abraham thought he was looking for land, but God was looking for alignment. And now for the first time they were in the same place. A man stripped of legacy, empty-handed but open-hearted, ready not just to walk, but to be formed. In chapter 9, we'll finally hear the full promise God gave, a promise not just for Abraham, but for every soul willing to separate in order to step into divine destiny. Because God didn't just call Abraham out, he called him forward. And now, the covenant begins. Stay with me. This is where it all comes together. Chapter 9. A theology of severance. God still calls us to leave. Abraham's story is not just history, it's a pattern, a prophetic mirror held up to every generation and every soul, because the call to leave was not just for then, it is still for now. God is still calling people out of what they've always known, so he can bring them into what he always planned. And the call hasn't changed. It still begins with a rupture, a tear in the familiar, a break from what once felt safe, certain, comfortable. Not everyone born with you will walk the road God has designed for you, Some people are scaffolding necessary in the beginning, but not meant to remain when the structure starts rising. Some seasons were meant to build you, but not to go with you. Some relationships were meant to form your character, but not to follow your calling. And sometimes what looks like loss is actually the beginning of alignment. Abraham shows us this truth. Faith doesn't cling. Faith releases. Real obedience always includes painful pruning. Real growth always costs us what once defined us. And we need to say it plainly, God sometimes removes the familiar to reveal the eternal. We see this theology of severance not just in Abraham, but throughout Scripture. Moses had to leave Pharaoh's house before he could lead God's people. Ruth had to leave Moab before she could become part of David's lineage. Peter had to leave his boat before he could carry the gospel. Paul had to leave the Pharisees before he could write 2/3 of the New Testament. Leaving is not abandonment, it's alignment. It's the sacred act of untangling your soul from every place that kept it small. And here's the truth, no one tells you. Sometimes you have to leave alone. Sometimes the only one who understands the calling is the one who gave it. God didn't call Abraham and his father. He didn't call Abraham and a committee. He called one man and told him to walk, not with a blueprint, not with guarantees, just with a voice. And you may feel the tug of that same voice, calling you to sever what no longer aligns with his purpose. Maybe it's a mindset, maybe it's a tradition, maybe it's an identity that others gave you but God never approved. Whatever it is, it's time to let it go. Because separation is not rejection, it's redirection. A holy tearing that leads to a deeper covenant. You weren't made for nostalgia, you were made for new wine. And now as we look back, we see that Abraham didn't just become the father of a nation. He became the blueprint for everyone who dares to believe that obedience is more valuable than origin. And maybe you're watching this and feeling it, the whisper, the nudge, the divine discomfort. God is not punishing you. He's preparing you. He's not stripping you to hurt you. He's clearing the way so he can speak again. Because when the old dies, the voice of God returns. And when you finally walk away from the last weight of what once was, you're finally free to walk into what could be. Stay with me, because in the next few minutes we're going to speak directly to those who feel like their journey is already behind them. If you're older, if you've lost time, if you've buried dreams like Terah, don't go anywhere, because the final message is for you, and it just might change everything. Maybe you've lived through your own or raised in systems, traditions, or expectations that never aligned with God's best. Maybe like Terah, you started toward a better place. But somewhere along the way, life pulled you into Haran, a place of compromise, a place of delay. And now years have passed. You've buried people, you've buried dreams, and you wonder if it's too late. But hear this, God is not finished with you. In Abraham's story, the promise didn't begin in youth. It began after loss, after delay, after Terah died. God waited not because Abraham was perfect, but because he was ready. You may feel behind, but in God's hands, surrender is always on time. So today, let go of what cannot go with you. You don't need to carry every legacy, just the one God gives you. Even now, he's still calling. Not just to move, but to separate, to listen, and to believe again. It's not too late to start walking, not away from your past, but into your promise.